Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today that's entitled Team Dynamics. We have got a great afternoon ahead with some consummate professionals. I am so eager for all of you to hear what they have to say about some scenarios that we've put forward for today. My name is Christine McKenna, and I am the director of the Rockingham County Drug Treatment Court here in New Hampshire. I've been a member of the NEARCP Board of Directors since 2015. So I'm really thrilled to be able to be a part of this webinar series that our organization puts together for professionals in this field. This is brought to you by the New England Association of Recovery Court Professionals, which is in partnership with the New England Addiction Technology Transfer Center, the ATTC, funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to have this marriage together, that we bring forward all these training materials and that we provide to not only the New England region, but around the nation. And I do believe we've had some international people as well. But the New England Association of Recovery Court Professionals is comprised of the New England states, and we basically exist to address critical and current emerging issues within the drug courts. And we promote our regional coordination. We share information, provide data, take on more information to provide us through a central forum and repository of resources that hopefully, not just for those of us in New England that can utilize, but elsewhere in our communities across this nation. So it's been wonderful to have this association. So today we have some great panelists here. We have the Honorable John Julian, who is the first Justice, Barnstable District Court, and the presiding judge for the Barnstable Drug Court in Massachusetts. So welcome, Judge Julian. We also have Michelle Williams. She is the Chief Probation Officer out of Charlestown District Court, so out of Boston Municipal Court. So I know she's been having a little bit of audio issues here, so we will have Michelle maybe coming in a little bit later. But we're welcome to have her. We also have Mr. Stephen Von Cetas, a regional drug court treatment coordinator for the Vermont Judiciary. Previously, he's worked as a clinician and management supervisor with the Philadelphia Treatment Court. And then we also have Heather Culp. She is an attorney and an educator and a circuit court administrator here in New Hampshire. She works specifically has been a lecturer at Harvard Law School and a facilitator and a clinical instructor at Harvard Law negotiation and mediation program. So she's going to be providing us some good analysis and foundation as we move forward for today. So none of this is new when we talk about the web work that we've all been doing, probably in the last 2 years, most of us now at this point. So for Zoom webinar controls, this is a little bit of housekeeping. Let's take a moment to become familiar with the Zoom webinar controls at the bottom of your screen. As you know, everyone should be muted. That really is the best way so we don't have a lot of background noise. We do want to hear from you. This is your time that you're here to share with us. So please utilize the question and answer feature, the Q&A feature. We will be monitoring it, and then I will present the questions to our panelists as we need to get some of the answers that you might like. Please know that this webinar is being recorded, so that all attendees need to remain muted, as I said earlier, with your video turned off during the entire presentation. The chat feature should be used to communicate additional information such as relevance, resources, et cetera, et cetera. What's a great bonus, not only from hearing from these wonderful panelists that we have today, is that you can receive evaluations and certificates, rather. So you will get an evaluation link from the New England Addiction Technology Transfer Center. If you complete this evaluation, it really helps us to provide improved products and continued support for this type of training. In addition, once you complete that evaluation and you send it back to us, we will make sure that you can get a certificate of completion for CEU for NADAC. So that's a wonderful bonus to get out of that. So I'm really thrilled to have to offer that as well today. And at the end of the presentation today, I'll kind of do some more housekeeping, talking about the forum that you will find on the NEARCP website, which is a great opportunity for folks to continue the conversation that we've had from today. Again, a great resource. You'll go and find different threads on there about different topics. So I really encourage people to utilize that function. Additionally, I will give some information about our up and coming yearly drug court conference that we have in New England that will be offered in March 2022. So stay tuned to hear some more information about that. So with that said, let's get started. And we're going to start today's presentation this afternoon with Heather Culp. As I said, she's from the judicial branch, and she's going to set the tone for us as we look at discussing team dynamics and how we manage, how we deal with conflict resolution and how we look at the management of our teams. And I know Heather's going to say it far better than I am. So with Heather, go right ahead.
Great. So thrilled to be with you all and really excited to hear more about the challenges that you all are facing in your drug court teams. And particularly as it relates to not just your team dynamics, but also your the outcomes for participants in your team, because we know that team dynamics actually impact outcomes for participants, right? So the benefit of providing this work around team dynamics is not just to have a better experience within your drug court, which certainly is beneficial for you and your professional life, but also to provide a greater experience for the participants in your drug court, that they understand what's expected of them, that they also have a greater likelihood of success when the drug court team itself is working well together. So let me begin here. And perhaps other panelists, if you could give me a thumbs up that you're able to see the presentation. Okay, great. So here's what we'll do today. We'll understand some common team dynamics within drug court teams, thinking through what those team dynamics are. Certainly you all can name some of those team dynamics, but we'll think through some scenarios together as well. We'll explore some of the barriers to healthy conflict management. And the reason that I use the term conflict management instead of just team dynamics is that the more that the panelists discussed what we meant by team dynamics, we often were talking about situations in which differences among the team arose to the level of a conflict that was impacting the team dynamic negatively, right? So I'll talk primarily about areas in which team dynamics produce conflict. So we'll explore some barriers to that, and then we'll explore some ways to better manage conflict in your drug court teams. Once again, just a piece on language here. I'm saying drug court teams to apply broadly. I fully understand there is a variety of language that folks use. I am, in fact, on a team right now that is set to start the first family treatment court in New Hampshire. We're very excited about that, one of the last states in the country to do so. And so I just want to acknowledge the different names for teams, but these certainly apply to everyone and everything. So
Heather.
Yes.
Heather, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We do see your slides, but we're not seeing presentation mode.
Okay.
So I apologize.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to try one more thing. All right, how is that, Christine?
That looks great.
Great, thank you. So first, if you could take out a pen and a paper, if you have one next to you, or perhaps your laptop, and think of a time on your drug court team when a disagreement or conflict between the team members was helpful. I'll give you just a minute to write that down. Even though I can't see all your faces, I imagine this may be a trickier question Then the second question, which is think of a time when a disagreement or conflict was unhelpful. Was unhelpful. So perhaps this exercise highlighted for you discrete moments that you might want to think about in the context of our conversation here today. We're hopefully going to give you some strategies for how to turn those sort of moments that conflict might be unhelpful into moments actually where that conflict or disagreement might be helpful. Something really beautiful about the construct of drug court is that it relies on disagreement and conflict between team members to produce the best result for participants, right? You are coming from places of difference, and that difference is honored in the drug court model, right? There are some people that are coming from a clinical perspective, which is different than a judicial perspective, which is different than a defense perspective. And all of those differences enhance and create a drug court team that can be both collaborative and problem solving. And so really thinking about those disagreements and conflicts as ways to produce better outcomes can also transform a bit the way we think about conflict on our teams in general. So our goal is to really channel as much as we can the disagreements and conflicts into helpful manifestations rather than unhelpful manifestations, because these are at the core of drug court. So why is this so important? I think first of all, managing conflict we often think is important because we have to resolve it. We have to get over it. We have to get through it, right? We use all this language about kind of trudging through the mud to get through it. When in fact, the process of handling conflict or the phases of handling conflict, resolution is only the last part, right? So often conflict can be handled in a preventative way. We can prevent as much as possible conflict from occurring. Now, we know because conflict can be good, that there should be space and time for managing conflict well and bringing out those benefits of conflict. So management is really kind of the second phase. And then if conflict becomes such that we can no longer simply manage the conflict as something that's inherently existing, then there may need to be some resolution of the conflict. So breaking conflict handling apart in these three different phases gives us a little bit better sense of how we can do some preventative work to prevent some of the resolution that would otherwise need to happen down the road. And it also gives some really concrete strategies for managing ongoing and regular conflict that we can expect to happen on teams. So we know that when conflict is handled poorly, it leads to kind of default decisions that may not be the wisest decisions. It can lead to people leaving the team, decreased engagement, and it can lead to poor outcomes for participants themselves, not just for you. But when things are managed well, you can come up with creative solutions. You're more able to honor your own roles and really utilize the benefit of that role for the benefit of the team. There's also a greater sense of procedural fairness. You know that when and to what degree your voice is valued and how it will be used in decision making. And it can also increase the satisfaction, not only of you, but also of the participants in drug court itself. So I want to distinguish here between process conflict and some of the more substantive conflicts that you might get into, right? So when I think about substantive conflict, it may be a disagreement about whether or not someone is motivated well, right? That's kind of a process, or that's kind of a substantive conflict. Process conflict is really about how do we make the decision about whether to admit someone or not to submit someone. Right, so separating those in your head to think about what are the substantive conflicts where we bring our own expertise and we sort of discuss together how we might do or what we might do, versus the process conflict, which is really about how are we going to make these decisions that we know we are going to need to make over and over and over again. And that process conflict can be a really substantial part of the initial preventative and management strategies for handling conflict in teams. Because if you set up a good and consistent process at the outset, you can simply use that process over and over again for a variety of different similarly situated situations, so that you then don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you're making a similar decision. So here's one of the challenges for us when we enter a team, right? We all come with our own back history and stories about what conflict is. And we may have very different experiences, very different family of origin around what conflict is. So we need to be aware that someone else's story about what conflict is may be very different than ours. So for instance, perhaps you came from a family like mine that really believed conflict was bad. So we better avoid it at all costs. We are not going to talk about anything controversial. We're not going to raise concerns with each other. We're simply going to eat our Thanksgiving dinner. So perhaps that's where you're coming from as well. There can be a value tinge to it. If you raise a concern, you are not a good person. Perhaps you're not a good worker. Perhaps you're not a good team member if you raise concern because you don't want to rock the boat, right? So understand if that's you. Perhaps you're someone who thinks that conflict is the other guy's fault, right? If that person just wasn't on our team, then everything would be better, right? When in fact, we all have contributions to conflict, even if our contribution is sitting back and not engaging at all. And so thinking about someone's belief about the other person, it's the other person's fault, and how you can really make it a joint problem on your team. Some people believe that conflict occurs when rational people become emotional, right? Those darn emotions, they just get in the way. In fact, we know from neuroscience that rationality, thinking, and emotions are not two separate things, right? And so it is a false dichotomy to say that we have to be rational and not be emotional. We feel emotions all the time and they impact our decision making. And so acknowledging that and figuring out how to best manage our decision making processes.
Looks like Heather might have frozen for a little bit. Let's hang tight for just a second.
So we talked about some beliefs that we might have about conflict, and now we want to talk about what is true about conflict. And this is based on research in the conflict resolution field, and certainly is true about drug courts. The drug court teams have been studied a little bit less than other kind of workplace teams. So I'd be curious if anyone wants to research drug court teams, that would be a great body of research. So what is true about conflict? First of all, conflict is value neutral. As we found from our exercise, conflict can produce great results and conflict can be deeply problematic. And so it is neither good nor bad. So it's really about the management of natural human difference that results in positive or not positive outcomes. We all contribute to conflict. Those emotions can't be eliminated, so learning how to manage them is really what we want to do in an appropriate drug court team model. And rationality isn't always the antidote to conflict. If you've ever had a really hard day and you come home and perhaps your partner starts thinking about problem solving, right? Well, you just need to think about it more like a math problem, right? That's not what you want to hear in the moment. You want some empathy with how you're feeling. And so it's not always the antidote to conflict and can in fact increase conflict if simply providing a right brain approach to everything is the way that we proceed. So we are going to talk about some strategies for managing conflict well as we get into the scenario. But truthfully, conflict is really an inherent and potentially productive part of what drug court teams are about. So some common conflicts, and we'll hear these highlighted more in our scenarios. First of all, how many of us love group projects, right? Most of you probably got to where you are in your career because you work really well individually. And when you have to, you can work well with groups. And this is almost the opposite model where we are invited to work with groups as the potential solution for increasing recovery in people's lives. And so it tends to go against a little bit of what we think about ourselves as professionals often, and invites us into this greater team approach. Now, sometimes we may still have perceptions about what it is to work in a team, and hopefully we can shift some of those perceptions to reduce some of these unhelpful conflicts and turn them into problems to be solved. So when we have done research on drug court teams, here are three major themes that have come out. And this is in part based on a Harvard study of New Hampshire drug court teams, but I've presented these three in multiple different locations, including in New England, and this seems to resonate with most folks. So sources of unhelpful conflict, decision-making, who gets in, what kind of sanctions will the judge give, when do we terminate somebody, right? Big decisions and how those decisions are made. That's a really substantial source of conflict for many drug court teams. What are team members' dual roles and how do they handle dual roles, right? If they show up to drug court, they're on a team when they're at drug court, but then they have to go back to their office and justify how that somehow fits into the role of advocacy as well. We know it does, of course, but thinking about how they may need to play a different kind of role back in their home institution. And then ineffective communication systems. Often there's some expectation by some members of a particular type of communication system. And then when that doesn't happen, they get dissatisfied and disengaged. So thinking through some of those ineffective communication systems that perhaps exist in your drug court. So briefly, I'll touch on these and then we'll get to our scenarios. So admissions decisions can really reflect differing views and approaches to drug court. So this is much more of a meta conversation than simply who gets in and who doesn't get in, right? So we'll talk about some strategies for having those meta conversations, but often this in particular highlights the perceptions of drug court in general and how those may differ. Often sanctioning discussions are seen as inefficient. This is also true of other responses, more positive responses to behavior, but sanctioning in particular is seen as inefficient. And termination decisions really often lack clear and shared criteria that all members of the group agree on. So we'll talk about some remedies for each of those later. For team members' dual roles, breaking down those common conflicts a bit more. There's sometimes conflict over external resources, particularly money, federal or state money that may be coming in to support drug court, right? You may be dealing with multiple agencies that are going for the same money. And so thinking through how external forces may be impacting the team roles at the table. Often there is some confusion between team members about confidentiality standards and who can share what with whom. And so that misunderstanding or expectation that isn't being met is a source of conflict. There's also some differing organizational commitments, right? So if you are, let's say you are a prosecutor and you think drug court is great, but your office does not really support it, you are probably not going to have the time and capacity to do the kind of work you want to do. And that will lead to conflict within the drug court team itself. So thinking through what members on your team, who else are they answering to behind them that aren't necessarily present in the drug court team, but are certainly impacting behavior in the drug court team. Finally, this larger category of communications, breaking that down a little bit more in what we've heard in the research. One, that staff meetings, the time set aside for staff meetings doesn't make sense for the purpose of the staff meeting. This could be said for any meeting ever, I think, that the time allocated doesn't always respond to what has to be decided. But particularly in drug court teams, if you have your staff meeting immediately before hearing, that is particularly challenging when you feel time pressure to make decisions and don't have a clear way of doing so. It's not always clear to drug court teams who is actually making the decisions, and more particularly, who is able to influence the decisions that are being made, right? So I think if you ask drug court teams, generally they will say, oh, judge makes final decision, right? But what does the process look like leading up to that decision? You will get 10 different answers from 10 different people. So that is definitely a source of conflict. There is also some conflict around staff splitting, making communication about a participant particularly difficult if different people on the team are getting different information from the same participant. So that itself can lead to communication challenges. So we will talk about how better to manage conflicts and solutions for these challenges after we go through those scenarios, which I think will highlight some of the challenges and help us kind of latch on to some solutions as we go along here. So I'll leave it to my colleagues for the scenarios.
Okay. All right. Everybody see my screen? Yes, good. Thank you. Okay. So with that said, we're going to get started with our case scenarios. I know we were having a little bit of technical difficulty. Michelle, are you with us?
I am.
Great, terrific. Oh my gosh, there you are. Wonderful. Glad to see you. Okay, all right. So good. We have our panel here. As I said, we have the Honorable John Julian is with us, as well as Michelle Williams, who's the Chief Probation Officer in Charlestown Division of Boston Municipal Court. And we have Stephen Von Cetus is with us as well, a Regional Treatment Court Coordinator in Vermont, who has also been worked as a clinician, et cetera, and management supervisor. So we have got a great panel along with Heather as well. So let's get started. So we've got a few scenarios here, and I will tell you that these are all live and real, okay? So our case scenario number one that's put out there, we had during team staffings, sometimes you'll see a couple of team members, but it could be any, are giving clinical recommendations to the team. So essentially what you're seeing is non-clinical non-clinical team members that are giving recommendations to the team. And they're suggesting to try different levels of care that don't necessarily rise to the same assessment level given by the clinical team. Probation, we also noticed that maybe the clinical team is less vocal in the meetings, potentially because they might be feeling a little bit more defensive, that they're not being heard or attacked sometimes. Probation is also recommending incarceration as the participants have probably a poor supervision history. They may have had multiple treatment attempts and may not has been successful as we would like to see. So they're making the recommendation for incarceration. So I'm going to turn this over to our panel and allow them to step in and give us their take on how they see this scenario, what are some possible outcomes, and what are some of the things that we should be looking for in our teams. Anybody can jump in.
I think I want to start from the perspective of probation. I think that the issue is literally his background. And in looking at his background, the recommendation is pretty stern based on the fact that he's been on supervision 10 out of 11 times, and all 10 times he was committed. So therefore, it is extremely important to understand that his rationale and motivation for success is a question for probation. The clinician has assessed him and says that he's motivated to spend time with his young child. But one of his current cases is a domestic with the mother of that said child who's only 3 years old. So it's a very touchy situation. And I think in terms of a public safety point of view, he did not complete the certified intimate batterers treatment program. So therefore, that's also an issue. The substance abuse as well as the background in terms of the batterers treatment programs that he's not been in compliance with. So the recommendation is pretty stern in terms of probation's perspective.
And, I'll just say that therein sometimes is the crux, right? That we've got, that's where treatment meets justice. That's one of the issues that we have.
So in looking at it from the perspective of the team leader, which I look at as the judge is the team leader, so it usually sits at the head of the table and facilitates the discussion. And my approach to that is that everyone has the opportunity to be heard, but the ultimate decision in the end is going to come down to the judge and what they feel is the most appropriate remedy. And I'm going to take that information from every single person at the table, because I don't profess to be a clinical social worker, so I don't know those realms. I'm not in the supervision role, so I'm not with the probationer as much with than the probation officer. And you can always see it, the participants love to be with the judge, but they're only with us for probably 10, 15, maybe an hour if the session goes an hour and a half. But they're with their probation officer at least 2 or 3 times a week, whether it be by phone or in person. So they know them intimately more than I do. So certainly I'm going to take the recommendations from all the parties and weigh what I think is the best scenario for the participant. And the factors that you're going to look at is that, we don't want to send them to jail because we know that in jail, chances are they're not going to get the treatment that they so desperately need. But there are some programs within the House of Correction systems that those participants may benefit and then go on to that next stop once they get out. So I'm going to look at Michelle and say, wow, this guy has violated 10 times. That's a lot. It's really important for me to consider that and whether they're going to be successful or not be successful. But I've got the treatment team saying high risk, high need. They really need a lot of treatment that they're probably not going to get behind the wall. So in the end, I'm going to listen to everybody. I'm going to take their information. I'm going to assess it. But in the end, just like whether it's a probation surrender or an admission on an open criminal case, the decision in the end is going to be mine. And I'm going to have to live with that decision, good, bad, or indifferent. But as long as I'm respectful to everybody in the room and listen to what they have to say, I think we're okay.
Yeah, and I'm just going to point out there that this is a stay in your lane scenario. So,
that's my favorite.
Yeah.
If I use that once in a team meeting, I use it 100 times. We all have our roles, we all have our passions, and we all think that everybody in the room has the best interest of the participants in mind. And I believe that wholeheartedly. It's just, sometimes it comes out differently. And like anything in life, people's nose get out of joint if they don't think they're being listened to. And I think it's important from the team leader's point of view is that everyone has the opportunity to be heard. And I make sure that when I make a decision, I let them know what my decision is and what the factors I use to do it. And I listen to everybody and let you know what's going to happen.
I think, Your Honor, one of the questions why probation questions his motivation is because of the fact that while he's been sitting in custody, he hasn't availed himself of any of the pretrial services in the jail. He's been in there for 3 months and it's all of a sudden, I want to get out. And he hasn't even looked into MAT as a potential. So it's just to get out to abscond again, because he's less than, one of the things about being intimate with the probationer is he has not been intimate with supervision. He hasn't reported consistently on any sort of basis. So that's what is his motivation? His motivation really to get clean and sober and pursue treatment. He would start that behind the wall so that when he is ready to be released, it's a better transition. And he hasn't shown any of that.
Absolutely.
When I look at this case scenario, I'm definitely thinking about the stay in your lane. So I appreciate that, Judge, you bringing that up. And I think what we're seeing is, I'm assuming it's happening pretty frequently, and that now our clinical team is being less vocal and getting a little defensive is what we're seeing. So we're starting to have our team structure and trust is degrading. And that would concern me greatly as a role that I'm currently in as a coordinator. We want to have trust amongst the team members, and hope that we'll wear the hat that we walk into staffing with. I think it's important to recognize that each role in and of itself coming into staffing or coming into a team has its own internal conflict. So for example, a clinician walking into staffing, their role in treatment court is very different than what they might be doing the other 20 hours a week for clinical work. What kind of things should I share? What's my role? And I think we see that particularly with any new team member, right? When they join the team, their role as defense counsel on the team, to some degree, a little bit different than what they might be doing with their other clients that they're working with.
Agree. And I think one of the heart of the matter, and I'm seeing a comment that was made, is that, the clinical team is the one who actually makes the clinical recommendation. There's nobody else, just as I would not make a legal recommendation. Now, the clinical team will say, this is the level of care that they've assessed at, et cetera, and then inform the court. Now, of course, the court, as the judge has just said, will take that into consideration, as well as, the concerns that probation has risen as well. But the clinical team members are the only people on the team that are qualified to give a clinical recommendation. And I think that's a stay in your lane issue, if you will. Heather, do you want to comment on anything?
Yeah, and I might actually have a different view about the stay in your lane phrase.
Okay.
So I think often stay in your lane, we know what we mean when we say stay in your lane. We mean, for instance, the clinical team is really the expert around making a clinical recommendation to the judge about what to do. If this is a sanctioning decision, it's not totally clear from the scenario if it's a sanctioning decision leading to incarceration, or if this is an admittance decision. But certainly the clinical team's role is to give clinical recommendations. So I agree with that. I think sometimes we say stay in your lane and people hear that as, oh, I don't want to raise a problem. Oh, I shouldn't ask a question. Oh, I shouldn't express a concern that's outside of the four corners of my role. And I think that actually hurts drug court teams, right? So there is a way in which, if I am not a clinical person, which I am not, there is a way in which I can ask about a clinical recommendation without making a recommendation that I am not qualified to make. So for instance, if I think the clinical team is not considering the level of someone's motivation to engage in treatment, I might, instead of saying, well, they just haven't been engaged in any of the treatment options in the past, I might say, clinical team, I'm really curious what your recommendation is in light of the fact that there hasn't been engagement in the past when engagement opportunities have been offered. Can you explain a little bit more from your clinical perspective why that might be and how we might respond to that, right? It raises the issue without me making a clinical recommendation that I'm purely not qualified to make. So that would, some people may consider that out of my lane, but I think staying curious and asking those good questions is really critical here. I think the other piece I'll say about the scenario is that if this is, depending on what kind of decision this is, and if I'm providing some technical assistance to this team on their conflicts, I'm going to ask them what their criteria is for admission. Because if the admission criteria has a substance use disorder, has been charged with a crime related to that substance use disorder, this person is in, right? Regardless of their motivation, regardless of their past history with parole, et cetera. But to me, this scenario indicates that there is squishy criteria for admitting someone into a drug court. And so I might suggest that this team actually have a half-day retreat and really identify together what is our objective criteria for admittance into this program, because then the admittance decisions get faster and much easier. Then the sanction decisions, if you have a sanction chart, get faster and easier. Then termination, there's a clear decision that can be made. There can be some debates back and forth, but you're not debating about the criteria itself because that's already been decided on. So just 2 points to mention from what's been said.
And I think that's a very good point too, because essentially, and I think we have another scenario that we'll talk about, our next scenario, we'll talk about this, looks at turnover. So we frequently will have change in our team members, right? So if we have changes in our team members, sometimes we need to come back to step one, and these are the criteria for different things, and as they align with best practices and how we use them in our court. So I think that's an important thing to consider. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to do a quick question was for Judge Julian, if I can find this real quickly. Treatment behind the walls was mentioned. Does having RSAT in Barnstable affect team dynamics in any way?
So the program that's in the Barnstable House of Corrections from the Sheriff's Department is a treatment-based program, and it's morphed a little bit because of COVID, and they had actually suspended it. And it's got a somewhat of a paramilitary kind of background, and they have to be in there for about 6 months. And they do a lot of dynamics and work on steps to better themselves on when they get on the outside. So for me, it's a great tool for me to use. They have to be sentenced. They can't be a waiting trial. And now it's starting to get a little different now that they have Barnstable County is now starting their MAT program within the House of Corrections, I think starting either next month or the beginning of the year. So there are certainly different dynamics, but it doesn't affect my team really in any way.
Thank you, Judge. I appreciate that answer. Okay, so we're going to go to case scenario number 2. This is, listen up, this is going to be a little detailed here. So the treatment court team has experienced turnover. You have a new clinical director, a case manager, and law enforcement representative. During court, the judge is often receiving conflicting information from the participants that they receive during the staffing. Case management is reporting that a participant is missing treatment and drug testing due to the participant's employment. In court, the participant says the misses are due to a lack of internet connectivity, and they cannot log in to the remote treatment or check the website for the lab. More participants are offering information that conflicts with case management reports, such as calling residential treatment to do intakes, keeping psychiatric appointments, and not being told where or when their community service sanction is. Sometimes agreed upon, or those that have already been discussed in this team staffing sanctions are being changed during court, as the judge may not feel comfortable imposing a higher magnitude sanction due to that lack of clarity. This is leading to some of those newer team members to even question the efficacy of the program. The new team members have not been fully trained in best practices and are struggling to understand why decisions are being made. And this has led to a breakdown in communication and arguments sometimes during staffing. Case management staff sometimes don't feel like they're supported, and the judge is frustrated with the lack of detailed and possibly incorrect information being given during staffing. I do say that this is a real scenario. I think we've all experienced. Who would like to start on that? Stephen, would you like to start on this piece?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot going on in this scenario. I think we can all agree to that. And I bet most of the folks listening to this today have had one, if not all of these things occur. The first thing I think of is just a concern between the relationship with case management, the judge, and perhaps other team members, around this communication piece. I'm hearing potentially some splitting from the participants. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. The first thing I really would want to do is just have a conversation with either the supervisor of the case managers, and also a conversation with the judge as a coordinator to bring them together and just kind of get it all on the table. Open communication. This is what I'm seeing. This is what we're hearing. What can we do about it to make some action steps, have some agreements to hopefully change that course, because ultimately, we're working for the betterment of the participants. And if we're not playing well in the sandbox and communicating well, then ultimately it's them that that are going to be hurt in the process.
So
I think-
I think what the way I look at this scenario, I think again, from my role, I have to go for, it's time to take a big, huge timeout. And one of the things that for me that is new and has been very good for teams, I think, is the role of the coordinator, because it's tough for the judge, one, ethically, to have substantive conversations with everybody alone or not in the group setting, because you got to be careful as to that line that you're walking. At that point in this scenario, having a coordinator that is able to speak to everybody and kind of take the temperature in the room, for me, is great. Now I can have that conversation with the coordinator when they've had a conversation with the clinician team. They've talked to the probation officer. They've talked to the peer recovery support people. They've had an opportunity to talk to the lawyers, whether they be from the prosecution or the defense, and sort of get a good sense of what's going on. There's going to be turnover all the time. It's just the nature of the business, because people don't get paid enough money and they move on. They have to. So you're going to have high turnover, whether it be from the district attorney's office, whether it's going to be from the private bar, whether it's going to be a probation officer moving on. So you've got to anticipate that stuff. But as long as there is a discussion and that we can mediate the issues, I totally agree with Stephen. If the team is out of sync, the participants are going to suffer, and they're going to sense that we don't know what we're doing, and they're going to try to manipulate the room, because that's what they do. So they're going to say, well, probation said to the judge this week, this is what happened. Nuh-uh, that's not what happened. I couldn't log on. It's not my fault. I don't have internet access. I don't have this. I don't have that. So I can't get in trouble for that stuff. So if they sense weakness in us, they're going to build on that. And we need to show strength for them in their recovery.
I think another issue is when we take a pause, we also reflect on the fact that we may need retraining. The new members need retraining, and it's important for people to realize that you don't know everything and things are changing. There's innovation in technology. We have to figure out how to work, troubleshoot Zoom and troubleshoot other things. So I think that that is very important as a team to reflect on where do we need to adjust and where do we need to go back to the basics and start over and start fresh. Because as new members come in, we do have to pinpoint all of the highlights and make sure that they're hitting the markers and making the appropriate recommendations and communicating well together.
Yeah, I agree with that, Michelle. One of the things I was looking at and thinking about is what does the onboarding and training look like for this particular team? If we're in this position with some very important positions, that are brand new being filled, and they're not trusting the efficacy, historically, what does the training look like? And to take a look at that, and can we get to conferences? Can we do some of the online trainings? Can we review both of the volumes, the NADCP? What kind of things can we offer so that they have a better sense of what direction we're supposed to be headed?
Yeah, and I would suggest actually doing that training together as a team rather than simply directing people to another kind of onboarding, or if you have online modules or something like that. I would actually suggest doing it together. This is a new team. It's not just new members on the old team. You're creating a new team whenever you have new people come on. And so doing some kind of reforming of this team and re-norming of what's expected from team members, I think is a really effective way, whether you do that at a conference or maybe you have a retreat together, maybe you take a day of what would have been staffing and convert that into solely, not a business meeting, but solely a reforming meeting. I think that makes a lot of sense. The other small piece here is, I just wanted to touch on what Judge Julian said. There is a role of the judge that is the most critical in this often, is to be making the decisions and to express the decisions made to the participant during a court hearing. often the facilitator, the meeting facilitator role that a judge is sort of believed is his role, doesn't align well with the judge getting the information the judge needs to make a good decision. I'm not saying that it can't happen. And when you're facilitating a meeting, you're in the meeting. I mean, Christine can attest to this right now, right? You're in the meeting. You're making sure everyone's doing their thing. You're making sure to include voices. You're not able to listen as well to gain the information and process the information you need to make a decision. So is there a way to delegate the facilitation of the meeting to the coordinator so that the judge can really be there and ask clarifying questions if need be, but can really be there to absorb the information the team has to share with her or him?
Very well said. I really appreciate, and we're getting some great comments on. I appreciate that that comment on that. Okay, panel. Before we move to the next case scenario, any follow up on this at all? Because it is a pretty extensive one, and I can appreciate. I love the renorming and reforming. I think that's a great way to approach this. Every time you have a new person coming in, I think it's a great idea. Okay, so we'll move to our next scenario. Scenario 3. In staffing and in court, we know that we have defense counsel who are bound by their ethical responsibility to their client, remain resolute to rigid application of their role in the justice system. Sometimes, and this is an actual example, looking at maybe contesting every sanction, maybe insisting on full evidentiary hearings that can be in conflict with the participants' recovery goals. Counsel often does not necessarily support the clinical team's recommendation for higher levels of care if their client is resistant to going to this higher level of care. What do we do with this, team, panel?
Well, well, certainly looking at from my perspective, everybody has a role to do, and defense counsel has their own role that they have, and they are bound by their own ethics that they took when they were admitted to the bar, that they're going to zealously advocate on behalf of their clients. Now, as the team dynamic goes on and as the defense attorney becomes more comfortable in the team setting, and as the opportunity to see that everybody in the room has the best interests of their client, not just the defense attorney, but you hear it from the prosecutor. You'll hear it from, if you have law enforcement in your room, that they may hear it from them. Probation is going to have their say, and they're going to say, I really want this person to be successful. So my hope is that counsel will see that and say that, okay, I'm going to listen to everybody. But again, I still need to advocate for my client, and my client says they don't want this. And I look at it, if someone wants a full hearing, they get a full hearing, and I'm not going to penalize somebody because they need to get their point across. And I think as the scenarios go on and as time goes on and the team dynamic continues, I think counsel, at least I've seen it in my own settings, that counsel looks at it that everyone is looking out for their client, not just them.
In this scenario, I think there's an issue of trust too. I think when counsel is saying one thing to the team and then presenting differently in front of their client, it messes with the trust between the professionals in terms of, well, that's not what we just discussed, and here it is, there's a change. I think it's important for counsel to be upfront when it is he has or she has to make the hard calls in terms of supporting their client's point of view and not the team. But it also needs to be a situation where everything is upfront in the beginning so that there's no confusion and there's that conflict is not happening in front of the probationer.
Good point. Yes, and that's having that united front, as the judge had been speaking earlier.
I'm hearing again a little bit of that we're not saying stay in your lane, right, Heather? But I'm hearing a little bit of that in the not supporting a clinical team's recommendation when, again, that particular person on the team, the defense counsel, is not the clinician, so I think we understand that if we're going to have disagreements, let's do that in staffing, and it's okay to have disagreements, right? We'll hear more from Heather, and we heard about it at the beginning, and some folks may sit back because that's how they want to deal with it, but just to recognize that we do need to have these disagreements. And I'm also thinking a little bit more, has this defense counsel had training specific to treatment court? There's a lot that is offered. I know defense counsel that recently has gone through a week-long training specific to treatment court. So just to think how for all of us, our role switches a little bit when we walk into staffing from what we might be doing the other 30 hours of the week, and that, again, it's all with the best interest of the participant. And I agree that I think over time, in seeing other roles supporting the participant, Judge mentioned the prosecutor, that's a change as well in that role coming into staffing. So hopefully in time and with training and trust, that would start to change.
And I know I say that whenever we go to national trainings or other regional trainings or those sorts of things, I always encourage my team members to attend different training. I'll go to a legal training, or I'll ask my case manager to go to a law enforcement training or something of that nature. And I don't want to say we make it mandatory, if you will, but it's very encouraged. And sometimes even ask them, hey, bring it back to the group. Tell us what you learned from that. And that kind of opens that up a little bit to them looking at through someone else's lens for a little bit. So because a lot of times we tend to go to a training and stay in our own, I won't use I was almost going to say it, Heather, but stay in our own area, right? We might, okay, I'm just going to go do something that is my own expertise. But no, encouraging your team members to go to other trainings is a good idea. I know as a coordinator, we have had, when we do our staffing, we'll do policy meetings as well. But one of the things that we'll do in policy meetings a couple of times a year is essentially bring out those best practice standards and looking at the roles and going through the standards this is what a substance use team does. This is what the role of the judge is. This is the role of the probation officer, and giving people time to reflect on that and looking at how is that being utilized respectfully and fairly within our own court. So I think that can be an important thing to look at too. So let's not forget that we have our best practice standards that we can go back to as well.
Yeah, I want to draw on a couple threads that you all shared. One is I think recognizing and respecting the professional obligations of each profession is really critical. And so doing some cross training on that, having each team member spend 10 minutes at the beginning of a staffing meeting, rotate it throughout the year to talk about their ethical obligations. Here's actually the language that I have to follow. Footnote on this, zealous advocacy is no longer in the professional rules of conduct for lawyers. So it's in the comments. The word zeal is in the comments, but it was removed from the professional rules of conduct, the model rules, I should say. So, but sometimes it's helpful just to look at the wording of what someone else's professional obligations are to get some of that. If you want to go to kind of stage 2 of building that empathy, as you said, Christine, do a chair rotation exercise. You could do this at an annual retreat or a regular policy retreat where perhaps a defense counsel sits in a particular chair. Have the clinical person sit in that chair and speak from the perspective of a defense counsel. And it shapes differently the way that we see each other. And it also prompts us to ask questions. So for instance, this third bullet about higher levels of care, I might ask counsel why. Tell me more about why your client is resistant to that, right? We may uncover a barrier through that question that we can then address in treatment court. Whereas if we just say, oh, that counsel is just very difficult, we can't do anything about that, right? So we've created a problem that we can't solve. Whereas if we stay curious, we might find out more information about the participant that would actually help us address some barriers.
Great, great. Thank you. I think, Stephen, you made a comment yesterday when we were all chatting about this today, asking yourself what hat you're wearing.
Yes, I think sometimes we have people in dual roles, right? We may have, and I think Judge, you spoke to this as well. We may have somebody who's a probation officer, but also an LEDC, right? So although licensed, on the treatment court staffing team, they are not a clinician, right? They are the role of the probation. So keeping ourselves in check when we have those, I have previous experience, clinical experience, but when I walk into staffing, I'm the coordinator for this team. That's what I'm doing today. And so recognizing that and keeping ourselves and talking openly, I think, with our team when we have those conflicts. But it will present itself. I'm sure it has on other teams as well.
Well, like anything, Steve, as Stephen said, as long as if you have those dual roles, and Heather, it seems to a great way to do it is to form it in the way of a question as opposed to a statement. I think this, as opposed to saying, why do you think that? Like, what are the reasons, and why should we do this as opposed to doing something differently? And I think that it takes the temperature down. It allows the clinicians to support their recommendations and put it all out on the table for the whole team to hear. And certainly for me to hear, because I certainly don't know anything about that. I need to know as much as that as I can. So.
Great, great. Thank you. Thank you, panel. Any further comments on this scenario before we move to Heather's final piece that she's going to be presenting for us before we go to Q&A? Okay, thank you. All right, so Heather, we will be taking it away with you again.
Great. So how do we better manage conflict? We've talked about a number of different strategies that our expert panelists have shared. We did an assessment of New Hampshire drug court teams a few years ago now. I believe it was about 5 years ago now. And they came up with a list of the top 6 recommendations, right? They could give us a kitchen sink of recommendations, I'm sure, about how to improve team dynamics. And it was really helpful to have kind of categories to think through how we might do things better. And it sounds like Christine's team has adopted some of those. So thankfully, some were implemented. So let's talk through these, and I'm not going to repeat things that we've already talked about. Just remembering those 3 phases of effective conflict management and how to move through phases, thinking primarily about that prevention phase. How do you do the most in the prevention? And then how do you create systematic ways to manage conflict is regularly occurring, right? New people are going to come onto the team. So have a plan for that in advance. That there's going to be sanctioning decisions almost every single week, if not every week, right? So create a system for that. That there are going to be termination decisions to make. Create a system for that. So thinking through how to systematically manage conflict, and then how do you resolve it if it's still not managed from there? Thinking through, and I combined 2 here, policy meetings and team norms. This is that reforming of the team that we talked about. Creating an environment in which people are welcome to raise differences, concerns, and alternative views. And along with that comes clarity about how those differences, concerns, and alternative views are going to be used, right? If there is not clarity that if I share something that is a different view, that it's not going to get shared with my boss, or it's not going to get shared beyond the team, then I am less likely to share it, right? So creating an environment certainly includes creating strong group norms that the team self-enforces, right? So if there's a rule in your team that you have to raise hands, perhaps that's a rule in your team, and someone starts talking without raising their hands first, everyone in the room needs permission to step in and say, hey, I'm sorry, could you just raise your hand, please, just so we're staying consistent with our team norms. Or even more powerfully, the judge or the coordinator could enforce that team norm so that it's consistently applied across the board. If those team norms are consistently applied within a few sessions, they'll be self-enforcing for the most part, right? So this can be kind of a heavy lift at first to create those team norms, but then they become self-enforcing if they're enforced. Identify a purpose for every activity. If you don't know why you're meeting, don't meet. If you don't know why the email is being sent, don't send the email, right? Make sure that there's a purpose to every activity and every communication, because then people know how to respond. So instead of getting 10 paragraphs back, you'll just get a yes or a no back if you're clear about what the purpose of that email is. Be clear about what people's roles are. We've discussed this. Is it in your policy manual what their roles are? Is it in the policy manual what expertise you expect them to bring to the table? Is it in your policy manual that everyone gets to ask questions of each other? Is it in your policy manual how you expect people to ask questions? Is it in your policy manual how you communicate over email in between drug court sessions? And who gets copied on what emails? Right, so being clear about what people's roles are also helps them know how best to communicate when they do have concerns. And address people's core concerns. People have a number of these kind of core concerns that come out in lots of different ways. Maybe if you don't feel appreciated, you're going to stop talking. Maybe if you don't have a sense that you have some authority to make some decisions or some recommendations, you're going to drop off the team and stop coming to meetings, right? If you don't feel an affiliation with your team, you're going to be less likely to stay a few minutes later at the end. And if you don't know what your role is and what your status is in the team, if the judge never asks you to speak or share your opinion, you're going to feel less engaged, and the group is not going to benefit from that opinion. So to the degree that other team members can be focused on, hey, have we appreciated law enforcement recently? You know, have we done some team building that has nothing to do with work recently? Address people's core concerns, and they're more likely to be committed to the team and be able to make some of those challenging decisions in policy meetings. This is a bit of a script for how to raise concerns, right? So when you have a concern with your team, maybe your tendency is to sit back and not say anything. Maybe your tendency is to say, hey, I have a concern about this thing, right? So identify what your default is, and then consider this sort of script. Be willing to take initiative in raising a concern, right? Hey, I've noticed we've been going over by about 20 minutes in each of our meetings recently. I'm really sensing a dynamic in which people are excited and they want to do this work. And I'm sensing that they're getting a little annoyed about being late. I know I certainly am. I feel busy and I feel stressed out, and I want to be a good contributor to this team. And I know I haven't said anything until now. It's been about 6 meetings where it's happened and I haven't said anything. So I'm owning that. I'm wondering if anyone else has thoughts about this and maybe what we can do about it moving forward, right? Anyone on the team could have said those words, right? And it's said in a non-offensive way that owns that it's a team problem. And maybe someone might say, look, I don't think it's really a problem. And so maybe you should leave. But that's highly unlikely if it's said in a way that takes ownership over contribution and acknowledges individual feelings behind it and the impact on the ability to do the good work. If concerns are underlying things and no one is willing to talk about that, consider one-on-ones. Maybe the coordinator can do one-on-one conversations with individuals to try to identify, get it, ask some of those questions if those questions are not being answered in the larger group. The role of the judge is so powerful in drug court, and not just because the judge is making ultimate decisions, but because everyone sees the judge as the authority figure, not just for decision making, but for process and for leadership and for setting the tone, right? So judge, recognize the authority that you have and use it sparingly. And the most effective way we've seen judges use their authority is to invite and highlight the voices of people who aren't speaking as much and who aren't sharing as much, right? So you have authority to draw folks out and to give people status in the room. And that is often the most powerful thing that you can do. You already have the power to make decisions, and people know that. An important thing about the decision-making authority of a judge, everyone in the room needs to understand how the decision is going to be made And I don't just mean the rationale behind it. I think that's really important. And Judge Julian, you mentioned that, but also the process by which it will be made. We took a quick poll in one of the last sessions on team dynamics, and there were a variety of ways that these decisions were being made, even though every single group said, oh yeah, the judge makes the decision. But these were the processes that they named. Note, these are all very different processes, right? A discussion process is different than a team coming to an agreement, which is different than consensus, which is different than a discussion, and then the judge ultimately says what their decision is. So be really clear about what your decision rule is. And if you need more on decision rules, I'm happy to share that with you. But there are a variety of decision rules, and everyone needs to be clear about what the decision rule is and how their input will be received and affect the decision. We talked about sanctions, admissions, termination decisions. Create a chart, create objective criteria absent any particular decision to make these decisions go much more smoothly. Don't do case by case. That's really inefficient, and it leads to less consistent outcomes. So create some objective criteria charts to make that decision move more smoothly. So to continue to manage conflict, create these constant feedback loops with stakeholders, certainly with those who are on the drug court team, but also with participants. Have you ever asked the participant how they view the drug court team? That may be a really interesting question to ask. You may not like the answer, you may not agree with the answer, but it can demonstrate the effectiveness in the team in doing what Judge Julian said, which is you need to be a singular team. And you need to demonstrate to people how to do problem solving and conflict resolution in their own lives. And so what better way to do that than to model that as a team? And so try to get some feedback from people outside of your team as well. And engage in a systematic review within the team. This can be a quick 5 minutes at the end of every staffing meeting or at the beginning. You know, what's working well on our team? What do we need to keep doing, right? Let's keep doing the things that are working well. And what could be done differently on our team to be more effective? This can be a quick shot, and you can make really quick, easy adjustments, even in the next staffing meeting to improve things. This is also a great preventative measure, so things don't fester for years and years and then come to a head in some really dramatic way. I've included a couple tools here, one called the circle chart that can help you work through this, and I'll send that resource. Can work through some problem solving. And then I just provide a quick summary of what we talked about here, creating this culture, recognizing and addressing these core emotional concerns, really creating objective criteria for repetitive decisions you'll have to make often, and then regularly reviewing how things are going and doing problem solving together in a systematic way. That's apart from the decisions that you're having to make every day. And that can really improve things. So I include my email address here. I also include Alex Casal, who is the drug court coordinator in New Hampshire, who oversaw the assessment that we had done, if you want to talk to him more about the assessment itself. But those are some recommendations based on what we discussed here today. And I think we're going to shift into questions, but I'll turn it back to Christine.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so I've been monitoring. We don't have any questions right this second, but please, I put out there, please bring forward any questions, maybe some of the things that you might be experiencing in your courts. You know, I was thinking as you were talking, Heather, I know, and I'm sure you are aware that New Hampshire courts, especially in the last 18 months, maybe, we've been going through the peer review process. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know when my court was peer reviewed, I thought it to be extremely beneficial. And we found out things that, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that maybe defense was feeling this way, or the case manager was feeling this way, et cetera, et cetera. And it was I thought it was a great mechanism for maybe what wasn't previously being said, even though I thought we were giving people that opportunity through different modes of communication, but for whatever reason, they didn't feel safe to, and that's a good reflection, but didn't feel that they could regardless. But it did come out through that peer review process. And so we were able to make some changes. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that feedback loop. It's part of a feedback loop, right? So doing regular, systematic, every single week reviewing how things are going, making some kind of 10,000 foot view recommendations as the team for each other, great. Doing regular policy or team meetings that are focused not on the specific business of cases, but on policy and practice. You can do some feedback sessions there. Maybe you have a longer discussion there. Great. And even more impactful potentially for the longer term is the peer review process, or you can have an assessment done like the New Hampshire courts had done, right? Similarly, you have people come in from the outside and talk to folks, and often they share things that otherwise wouldn't be shared otherwise. That's not necessarily a symptom of unhealth of your team. It's simply a symptom of us being human, right?
Mm-hmm.
Someone asks us an opinion and we are far more likely to share it with a stranger than we are to share it with someone that sits next to us every day, right? So I think you get different kinds of insights from each of those things, and I wouldn't divorce them from one another or say they're mutually exclusive. Judge Julian?
Well, I think that's a great point. And one of the things I try and do, and I try to do it quarterly. I don't always do it quarterly, but I at least try to do it twice a year, is I'll come out in the middle of a session with a full complement of all the participants. I'll come out without my robe on. I'll put a chair in the middle of the room, and I'll say to them all, this is your opportunity to tell me how you think things are going. I need you to do it respectfully. I don't want you to do it, calling people, out or names or whatever. But this is your journey. And if we're not supporting you in a way in which is helping you, we need to know it. You can't not tell us. And it works. It takes the temperature down in the room that you're just the judge. You're actually someone who is out to help us, and that they feel more comfortable at that point when I'm out there without my robe on, and I'm just sort of not up high on my bench. I'm just sitting in the middle of the room having a discussion with them. So I think it's important, like I think Heather, she brought that out, that they have a say in what's going on too, although it's a court proceeding, don't get me wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But still, they're going to get more out of it if they put more into it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Judge. And one of the things I was thinking, as both of you were speaking, I know for my team, we plan one, if not two retreats a year, where we literally just go and have fun. We try to, and to be fair, we try to say we're not going to talk shop, if you will, but it does happen because that's just the nature of the business. But the intention is for people to get to know one another in a different context and laugh and build some of those relationships. Now, we all know that there's some self-protection going on. That's just a part of human nature. But it really has, I think it improves. I think that the temperature, especially when you're trying to do some management of conflict and managing disagreement and so forth. And I know it has helped a great deal. So I certainly would encourage teams to consider that. Anything else that they would like to talk about that might be working in your teams or your courts? I've got a quick question here if any of our panel members wants to jump in with anything that they find working for them. But I've got a quick question here from a sober house in Hull, Mass. And they're asking if there is a drug court in Hingham District Court. So I don't know if any of our Mass people can answer that one. I cannot.
There is. Judge Bradley is the presiding judge in Hingham, and she has a recovery court.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judge Julian. Terrific. Okay. Anybody else have anything? Any panel members? Do you any parting words or anything that you would like to bring out here at this web? We certainly would appreciate any extra things that you would like to add. Oh, I got a quick question before we go. I'll give everybody a minute to think. What do you do when only 3 of 8 team members attend the training? Oh, this training, but yeah, okay. So I think that the questioner is only asking specifically for this, but I think that probably can speak to other things as well. If you've only got some of your people coming and buying in.
Why we record them.
Ooh, that's why we record them. There you go. There you go. Yeah, you can have them
Definitely have a bring back session so that everybody's back on track. Do an in-house in training.
Great.
Have everyone review it.
Good. Yeah.
I think you can see. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to suggest also when in going back, right, to use the case scenarios that we discussed today. There's no perfect solution to kind of work through these. We all have an idea of how to do it and do it diplomatically and in the best interest of our participants. But I think it could be interesting to see how your team responds to each scenario, and then to use some of the information that Heather has given us today to work through and see what's really going on with your own team.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
we call it facilitating from your chair, right? You don't have to be the leader. You don't have to be the majority. You can still implement a lot of these suggestions just from doing it from your chair.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. That was helpful. Any last words, panel members?
I think one thing that people should take away is we are all adults and we can agree to disagree. We're not always going to agree, but we have one common goal, and that is service.
Excellent. Thank you, Chief. Thank you. Okay. Wonderful. So please know that, we will be sending out the evaluation via link, and we will have people have access to the slides. There'll be a transcription as well. I know, Heather, I've spoken to you. You have indicated that you will make your slides available. We thank you deeply for that, because I think this has been really immeasurable to so many people. And so that will be very helpful as we take this stuff back to our courts and try to integrate and, really provides that good foundation. So thank you so much. I want to remind people of our website, NEARCP.org, which I did put in the chat. We have a forum if people want to go there to continue the conversation, or even just look at other topical things that we've done in the past, or if people have a conversation, or even if you want to start one on something totally different, and your peers may log in at some point and see that and provide you that answer that maybe you didn't know was out there. So that can be very helpful. But we also keep our webinars on there, previously recorded webinars that we've been doing for about 2 years now. So there's quite a few of those on there, a lot of good content from various resources that we have cultivated from around New England and the nation, actually, from the presenters that we've had. And then also, as I said, I'll put a plug out there for our conference coming to you in live person, March 2022. You'll find out some conference information as it's being developed. That too will be on the webinar. So I want to thank everyone today for being here. I want to thank our panel members. This is really, can be heavy work. It can be really heavy work, and to kind of go through some of these potentially thorny discussions. Every one of you gave us great insight, and really some things to take away from each one of you that I know I'm bringing back to my court. And we're really grateful that you're able to take the time out of your busy schedules to work with your peers. Thank you. Thank you all. Good health. Everybody stay healthy.